This is the unknown zone, where the greatest victories hide in silence and every inch of freedom was paid for in blood. On June 6, 1944, the world held its breath. From the dark skies over Normandy to the storm-tossed waves of the English Channel, thousands of young men crossed into history. It was the day the tide turned, the day hope came from the sea. This is Operation Overlord, the inside story of D-Day. In the winter of 1943, the world was balanced on a knife's edge. For 4 long years, Europe had been under the shadow of Nazi control. Cities burned, nations vanished, and millions were enslaved by the machinery of a single idea. But across the Channel, in the rain-soaked airfields and quiet English villages, another machine was being built, one made of courage, secrecy, and hope. It was called Operation Overlord. At its heart, Overlord was a gamble, a single massive stroke that could end the war or lose it. To cross the English Channel and land an army on a fortified continent was an act of impossible ambition. Every soldier, every ship, every plane that took part would be risking everything. If it failed, Hitler's empire might stand for another generation. If it succeeded, Europe could be free again. But before the first boat touched sand, before the first parachute opened in the night sky, this invasion existed only as an idea, a whisper in war rooms and secret bunkers, shaped by fear and calculation. The plan began with one man, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a calm, disciplined general from Kansas, who now carried the weight of history on his shoulders. He was chosen to command all Allied forces in Western Europe, an army of men from a dozen nations, united by one purpose: to take back the continent. Eisenhower knew that even the smallest mistake could destroy everything. He had seen what happened at Dieppe in 1942, a failed raid on the French coast that ended in disaster. Nearly 60% of the attacking troops were killed, wounded, or captured. The lesson was clear. The enemy's coastline was a fortress. Breaking through it would require precision, deception, and absolute secrecy. For months, Allied intelligence studied the French coast. Every beach, every tide, every cliff. They analyzed sand samples, water currents, and weather patterns. They even sent commandos disguised as fishermen to collect soil for testing. The fate of the invasion could depend on whether a tank would sink or move on the sand. The enemy, too, was preparing. Along the coast of France, Germany had built the Atlantic Wall, a massive chain of bunkers, gun batteries, and obstacles stretching from Norway to Spain. It was one of the largest defensive networks in history, and Hitler believed it was impenetrable. Every beach was mined, every approach watched. To the German generals, an invasion across the Channel seemed suicidal. But the Allies had a weapon that no fortress could stop: deception. Months before the invasion, they launched Operation Bodyguard, a campaign of lies and illusions. Fake radio traffic suggested that the main attack would come not at Normandy, but at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. Inflatable tanks and dummy aircraft were positioned across southern England. A fictional army commanded by the legendary General Patton was stationed to lead a non-existent assault. Every photograph, every message, every whisper was designed to fool German intelligence. The success of Overlord would depend on whether the enemy believed the lie. As 1944 began, the scale of the operation became almost unimaginable. More than 150,000 troops would have to cross the Channel in a single night. They would be carried by 5,000 ships and over 10,000 aircraft. The invasion fleet would stretch from horizon to horizon, the largest armada the world had ever seen. Every piece of equipment, every ration, every bullet had to be ready and in the right place. Factories worked without rest, airfields filled with gliders and bombers, ports overflowed with landing craft. Every road in southern England was jammed with convoys of men and machines. The country itself became a staging ground for liberation, but for all the planning, one force remained beyond control: the weather. The Channel was a stormy sea, unpredictable and cruel. High winds or fog could scatter the fleet and make landings impossible. The invasion could only succeed under very specific conditions: a full moon for visibility, low tide for spotting mines, and calm waves for the landing craft. Those conditions would come only a few days each month. If the weather turned, the operation would have to be delayed, and secrecy risked exposure. By early June, everything was ready. Troops were briefed, ships were loaded, aircraft fueled. Eisenhower walked among the soldiers, shaking hands, asking names, listening to jokes and fear alike. He knew that thousands of them would not return. Each face he saw carried the weight of his decision. He had given the order, "Go." And now all he could do was wait. On June 4th, the weather turned violent. Winds howled across the Channel, waves crashed against the docks, and visibility dropped to near zero. The invasion was postponed. Commanders debated, meteorologists argued, and tension filled the air like static. Every hour of delay increased the risk of discovery. Then, on the night of June 5th, the clouds began to break. A brief window opened, rough but possible. If they waited, they might not get another chance for weeks. If they went, they might lose everything. Eisenhower gathered his commanders in a small room in Portsmouth. Silence filled the air as the meteorologist delivered the forecast. A temporary clearing, lasting just long enough for the landings to begin. Eisenhower looked at his generals, then at the map. He thought for a moment, then spoke 5 words that changed the world. "Okay, let's go." With that, Operation Overlord was set in motion. The largest invasion in history was about to begin. Across the airfields, thousands of paratroopers prepared to board planes. In the harbors, sailors climbed aboard landing craft. In the darkness, engines roared to life. No one knew what waited on the other side of the sea, only that it was freedom. As dawn approached, the sky over England filled with aircraft. Waves of bombers, gliders, and paratrooper planes stretched for miles, vanishing into the clouds. Below them, the sea shimmered with the reflections of ships. Destroyers, transports, and landing barges forming an endless line across the Channel. Every man carried the same fear and the same hope. They were young, many barely 20, but in their hands lay the future of the world. The beaches of Normandy awaited them, silent beneath the moon. The greatest gamble in human history had begun when Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the order to proceed with Operation Overlord. The world shifted quietly on its axis. But long before the first soldier stepped into the surf of Normandy, the invasion had already begun. In maps, in minds, and in an endless stream of plans that reached from London to Washington. Behind the name Overlord stood the greatest collaboration of military and human ingenuity the world had ever seen. The task was not merely to land troops on a beach. It was to create an entire floating continent of men, machines, and supplies capable of sustaining an army deep into enemy territory. Every tank, every bullet, every mouth to feed had to cross the sea. And once they landed, there would be no retreat. At the center of it all was Eisenhower, the calm commander with a farmer's patience and a diplomat's mind. He understood that Overlord was not just a military operation. It was a political and moral balancing act between allies who didn't always agree. He managed egos as carefully as he managed divisions. His generals were brilliant, but each carried the pride of his nation. Baynard Montgomery, the British Field Marshal, confident and theatrical, demanded command of the land forces. Omar Bradley, steady and quiet, would lead the American First Army. Churchill, ever the strategist and poet, pushed for boldness, for speed, for vision. Roosevelt sent words of caution, urging unity and coordination. Eisenhower's challenge was to turn these forces, human and mechanical, into one mind. The planning began in earnest in 1943. It took over a year to design the assault that would strike the heart of Hitler's Europe. Normandy was chosen not because it was easy, but because it was unexpected. The coastline there offered enough open beaches for landings, yet was lightly defended compared to Calais, where the Germans believed the main invasion would come. The element of surprise was worth the risk of the cliffs, the tides, and the narrow roads beyond the beaches. To prepare, the Allies constructed mock beaches across southern England. They practiced landings under live fire, tested vehicles in tidal zones, and trained men to move through chaos. Every soldier who would set foot on French soil learned to climb obstacles, to disarm mines, to wade under fire. They were told nothing of the location, only that what they were training for would decide the fate of the world. Every element of Overlord had to be invented. There were no precedents for such a massive operation. Even the ships had to be redesigned. The Allies built Higgins boats, flat-bottomed landing craft, capable of carrying 30 men straight onto the beach. They built amphibious tanks that could swim ashore and fire immediately. They even built artificial harbors, known as mulberries, made of floating concrete and steel. When assembled off the coast of France, they would become temporary ports, allowing ships to unload directly onto the beaches. Each mulberry was the size of a small city, built in secret and tested in British waters under cover of darkness. The scale of logistics was staggering. In the months before D-Day, more than 2 million men were stationed in Britain. Nearly 7 million tons of supplies were stockpiled. Weapons, fuel, food, uniforms, vehicles, spare parts, and medical equipment. There were over 150,000 vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, and 5,000 ships involved in the operation. Every item had to be labeled, catalogued, and placed in the exact order it would be needed once the landings began. Nothing could be left to chance. Even the smallest detail mattered. Engineers tested sand and soil samples taken from the beaches, smuggled out by covert agents disguised as tourists. Meteorologists tracked the winds of the channel with precision never before attempted. Code breakers at Bletchley Park fed intelligence to Eisenhower's staff, intercepting German communications and giving the Allies an invisible advantage. Every step forward was met with tension. The closer they came to launching, the more fragile the plan became. A single leak could destroy everything. Eisenhower imposed total secrecy. Entire divisions were confined to camps under armed guard. Letters home were censored. The location of the invasion was known to only a handful of men in the entire Allied command. Even as the soldiers trained, they sensed the magnitude of what lay ahead. They wrote letters marked, "To be opened in case of death." They carried photographs of families and sweethearts in their helmets. They joked to hide the fear, but every man understood. When the order came, they would be walking into the unknown. In London, a small room beneath the War Office became the nerve center of the invasion. Maps covered the walls, dotted with colored pins, marking divisions, airfields, and naval routes. Every hour, new reports arrived. Weather forecasts, resistance movements, intercepted German messages. Teams of analysts worked around the clock, adjusting plans in real time. One of the most critical parts of Overlord was timing. Every phase, the airborne drops, the naval bombardments, the beach landings, had to unfold in perfect synchronization. If the paratroopers jumped too early, they would be surrounded before dawn. If the landing craft arrived too late, the tide would rise and swallow the beaches. There was no room for error. The invasion was divided into 5 landing zones, each given a code name: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Utah and Omaha would be taken by the Americans, Gold and Sword by the British, Juno by the Canadians. Each had its own challenges: cliffs, flooded fields, heavy fortifications, or narrow exits. The Germans, meanwhile, believed the Allies would strike at Calais. Their best divisions were stationed far to the north. Hitler himself refused to move them, convinced that the Normandy landings, when they came, would be a diversion. It was a mistake that would cost him his empire. By the spring of 1944, Operation Overlord had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just a plan on paper. It was a living organism of men and machines, each depending on the other. Factories worked day and night, airfields thundered with engines, and the roads of England disappeared under the endless flow of convoys. Villages that had once been quiet became crowded with troops from across the world: British, American, Canadian, French, Polish, Australian, and others. They shared rations, cigarettes, and the same nervous laughter before the storm. Eisenhower visited every camp he could. He spoke simply, like a man who understood the weight of what he was asking. He told them, "The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." To the young soldiers, those words meant everything. For many, it was the last speech they would ever hear. In the final days before the invasion, weather reports once again turned grim. The English Channel churned with wind and rain. Landing craft tossed like leaves in the surf. Commanders began to doubt whether the operation could go ahead. The invasion had already been postponed once. Another delay could ruin the carefully built illusion. Eisenhower faced the hardest decision of his life. His generals argued. The meteorologists warned of uncertainty. But the narrow window remained. One brief pause in the storm that could last only hours. He paced the room, silent, then finally spoke. "Okay, let's go." In that moment, the wheels of history began to turn. The paratroopers tightened their harnesses. Pilots climbed into their cockpits. Sailors loaded the last crates of ammunition. And in the stillness before dawn, across the ports of southern England, engines began to roar. The invasion had begun to move, not yet toward the beaches, but toward destiny. Just after midnight on June 6th, 1944, the night sky above the English Channel was alive with motion. Engines hummed in the dark. The moon broke through the clouds in thin silver lines. and beneath it, the largest armada in human history began to move. Operation Neptune, the naval phase of the D-Day invasion, was underway. It was the steel and saltwater heartbeat of Operation Overlord, a force so vast that sailors later said you could walk from one side of the channel to the other without touching the sea. Nearly 7,000 ships, warships, transports, landing craft, and support vessels stretched across the water. They carried over 150,000 men, 10,000 vehicles, and millions of tons of equipment. The ocean was filled with motion, destroyers rolling in the swell, troop carriers plowing forward in long columns, and landing craft bouncing like leaves on black waves. For hours, the ships moved in silence, their lights dimmed, their crews speaking in whispers. Every man aboard knew what awaited them on the far shore. The first to cross the line were not the soldiers of the beaches, but the airborne troops. Shortly after midnight, more than 23,000 paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with British and Canadian airborne units, jumped into the darkness of occupied France. Their mission was to secure the roads and bridges behind the beaches, to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast once the invasion began. It was chaos from the moment they jumped. Low clouds, scattered formations, anti-aircraft fire lit the sky, and many paratroopers landed miles from their intended zones. Some fell into flooded fields, others into trees or enemy positions. Many never found their units again. But despite the confusion, small groups of men began to fight wherever they landed. They ambushed convoys, seized bridges, cut phone lines, sowing chaos behind German lines. By dawn, the countryside of Normandy was alive with scattered pockets of resistance, each holding just long enough for the invasion below to succeed. Far below, in the cold waters of the Channel, the Armada continued its slow crawl toward France. The operation's precision was astonishing. Thousands of ships, each on a timed course, converging on 5 narrow beaches along a 50-mile stretch of coastline. Navigation lights blinked on and off in sequence. Radar operators tracked their positions in silence. The sea was rough, the wind sharp, and many soldiers were already seasick before they ever saw land. On the decks, men wrote final letters home and tucked them into their pockets. Some prayed quietly. Some stared into the dark horizon, lost in thought. They were farmers, students, miners, and factory workers. Turned soldiers by history's demand. They had been told the beaches were heavily defended, but no amount of briefing could prepare them for what was waiting. The Germans had been watching the Channel for months, but they were caught off guard. Bad weather had convinced them that no invasion would come that night. Many commanders were asleep. Some were away from their posts. Even Field, Marshal Rommel, tasked with defending the coast, was in Germany visiting his wife for her birthday. That brief lapse of vigilance, just a few hours of complacency, would cost the Reich its empire. At 3:30 a.m., the naval bombardment began. The sky over Normandy erupted in flame. Battleships and cruisers opened fire, their shells whistling across the night sky like thunder rolling from horizon to horizon. Each explosion lit the sea for miles, bursts of orange and white reflecting off the waves. German bunkers along the coast shuddered under the impact. Entire hillsides disappeared in smoke and dust. To the men waiting in landing craft, the sound was deafening but reassuring. They knew those guns were clearing the path for them. At least, they hoped so. By 5:04 a.m., the first landing waves began to form up. Small, Flat-bottomed boats, packed with soldiers, weapons and gear, started their descent toward the beaches. The men stood shoulder to shoulder, soaked in spray, gripping their rifles. Some vomited over the sides from the rolling seas. Others just stared at the horizon, where flashes of fire marked the French coast. They had trained for this moment for months, but now it felt unreal. The coxswains shouted orders over the roar of engines and waves. 10 minutes, 5 minutes, then silence, except for the wind and the crash of surf. At 6:30 a.m., the first rams dropped. The invasion of Europe had begun. On Omaha Beach, the landings went almost according to plan. Strong currents pushed the first waves slightly off course, but that mistake saved hundreds of lives. They landed in a weaker section of German defenses. American troops, led by General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., pushed inland with minimal resistance. Roosevelt, already in his 50s and walking with a cane, famously told his men, "We'll start the war from right here." But at Omaha Beach, the story was very different. The defenders were waiting. German machine guns, mortars and artillery opened fire as the landing craft approached. The sea turned red within minutes. Dozens of boats were destroyed before they could even reach shore. Men leapt into the water under heavy fire, many drowning under the weight of their packs. Those who made it to the sand found themselves pinned down with nowhere to hide. Omaha was a killing ground. The air was filled with smoke, bullets, and screams. Officers were dead, radios destroyed, plans useless. For hours chaos reigned. It was not courage that saved the day there. It was survival instinct. Small groups of men, often leaderless, began to crawl forward, using shell holes and obstacles for cover. They scaled the cliffs, one by one, dragging wounded comrades behind them. By noon, through sheer willpower and sacrifice, the Americans had gained a fragile foothold. The cost was nearly 3,000 casualties in the first few hours alone. Further east, the British and Canadians faced their own nightmare. At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, the resistance was fierce but better contained. Tanks rolled ashore, engineers cleared mines, and waves of infantry pressed inland. The Canadians at Juno suffered heavy losses in the first wave, but by afternoon they had advanced deeper into France than any other unit. The British linked up with airborne troops from the night before, securing bridges and key roads. By evening, all 5 beaches were in Allied hands. It had been the most ambitious military operation in history, and it had worked. But the victory came at a terrible price. By the end of the first day, more than 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The beaches were littered with wrecked vehicles, burned landing craft, and the bodies of the fallen. The sea itself was red and silent again. Yet, amid the devastation, something extraordinary had begun. A fragile line of freedom had been drawn across Europe. Behind the beaches, new waves of troops poured ashore. Engineers built roads and harbors out of steel and rubble. Tanks rolled inland, and field hospitals treated the wounded under open skies. The German army was falling back, stunned and disorganized. In the villages of Normandy, French civilians emerged from hiding to greet the soldiers. For them, the invasion meant more than strategy. It meant liberation. After 4 years of occupation, they saw Allied flags fluttering in the wind, and they knew the world was changing. Operation Neptune had done its job. The impossible had become real. The tide had turned. But for the men who survived that day, D-Day was not the end. It was only the beginning. By sunrise on June 6, 1944, the world had changed forever. The English Channel, once a symbol of separation, now carried the weight of liberation. Tens of thousands of young men had crossed those cold waters and met the walls of Hitler's fortress. And the day that followed would become known simply as the longest day. The sun rose through a haze of smoke and seawater. The beaches of Normandy were chaos. The air was filled with the stench of gunpowder, oil and blood. Landing craft, tanks and bodies floated together in the surf. The cries of the wounded mingled with the relentless thunder of artillery. Yet amid that storm, men kept moving. Step by step, inch by inch, they fought their way out of the water and into history. On Omaha Beach, the first waves had been nearly destroyed. Hundreds of men were still pinned down, trapped behind shingle banks and steel obstacles. German machine guns fired endlessly from the bluffs above, cutting down anything that moved. But as the morning wore on, small groups of survivors began to reorganize. Sergeants, lieutenants, anyone still alive, took charge. They used smoke from burning vehicles for cover, crawled up ravines, and scaled cliffs by hand. Engineers cleared mines under fire, blowing gaps through the wire. By late morning, through sheer will, they had reached the top. When the Americans finally broke through the German lines overlooking Omaha, they turned the guns around and fired back towards the beach. For the first time that day, the defenders began to retreat. At Utah Beach, things had gone differently. The currents had pushed the landing craft 2 miles off course. But it was a mistake that saved hundreds of lives. They came ashore on a lightly defended stretch where German resistance was thin. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., walking with a cane, famously told his men, "We'll start the war from right here." By afternoon, Utah was secure, and the Americans were pushing inland to link up with the airborne troops who had dropped in the night before. Further east, the British and Canadian beaches were a storm of their own. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, the troops faced mortar fire, flooded fields, and fortified villages. They fought from hedgerow to hedgerow, from house to house. At Juno Beach, the first wave of Canadians suffered nearly 50% casualties, but they refused to stop. By evening, they had advanced deeper into France than any other unit. At Sword Beach, British commandos fought their way into the town of Ouistreham, linking up with paratroopers, holding the bridges across the River Orne. For the first time since 1940, British soldiers stood on French soil as liberators. By mid-morning, the beaches were under control, but the cost was staggering. On the sand, medics worked without rest, setting up makeshift field hospitals under fire. Priests and chaplains moved among the wounded, offering last words and quiet prayers. The dead lay where they had fallen, in the surf, in craters beside their weapons. The tide washed in and out, carrying away helmets and dog tags. The engineers, meanwhile, began building the foundations of victory. Bulldozers cleared wreckage, opened roads, and constructed causeways across the dunes. Supply ships dropped anchor offshore, unloading tanks, trucks, and fuel. In a single day, more than 4,000 tons of equipment reached the beaches. Every crate unloaded meant another step inland. The sea itself became a lifeline. Across the channel, a constant stream of reinforcements and supplies flowed toward Normandy. By nightfall, over 150,000 Allied soldiers were ashore. They had not yet won France, but they had secured a foothold that would never be lost. For those who lived through it, the memories of that day never faded. They remembered the sound first, the roar of engines, the screams of shells, the metallic whistle of bullets slicing the air. They remembered the faces of men beside them, many of whom they never saw again. And they remembered the moment when fear turned to determination, when survival became victory. One soldier later wrote, "You couldn't think about the whole beach. You just thought about the next few yards, and somehow, when you looked up again, you were further than you expected to be." That was how D-Day was won. Not by grand strategy or speeches, but by ordinary men taking one step forward when every instinct told them to stop. But the battle was far from over. Beyond the beaches lay the hedgerows of Normandy, a maze of fields, walls, and narrow lanes that would soon become killing grounds of their own. German reinforcements were already moving in from the interior. Tanks, artillery, and the feared SS Panzer divisions were on their way. The Allies had to push inland before they were thrown back into the sea. For Eisenhower and his generals, the first 24 hours were both triumph and terror. They had achieved the impossible, landing a vast army on enemy shores. But now came the real fight, to hold it. If the Germans counterattacked in force before the Allies could unite their beachheads, the invasion could still fail. Every road, every bridge, every intersection mattered. The fate of the free world still balanced on a razor's edge. The airborne divisions, scattered and bloodied from the night before, fought desperately to hold key positions. At Sainte-Mère-Église, American paratroopers clung to the town against repeated German assaults. In the fields around Carentan, isolated groups of men dug in with whatever weapons they had. They were surrounded, cut off, and outnumbered. But they held. Their resistance bought precious hours for the beach forces to advance and link up. The British and Canadians pushed toward Caen, a city crucial for controlling the main roads of Normandy. The fighting there was brutal. Street to street, house to house, every corner contested. It would take weeks before Caen finally fell, and thousands of men would die for each mile gained. By the end of June 6th, D-Day was not yet a victory, but it was no longer a gamble. The Allies had established a beachhead, 5 footholds of freedom carved into the coast of tyranny. Behind them, the sea roared with endless waves of ships carrying reinforcements. Ahead of them lay France, scarred, occupied, and waiting. The cost had been unimaginable. On that single day, over 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The German losses were nearly as great. The beaches of Normandy were soaked in blood from both sides. An ocean of sacrifice that marked the turning point of the war. And yet, amid the horror, there was hope. For the first time in years, the people of Europe had seen the dawn of liberation. French villagers stepped cautiously from cellars and barns, waving tattered flags and weeping as Allied troops passed. A farmer handed bread to an American soldier who hadn't eaten in 2 days. An old woman kissed the hand of a British medic who had just saved her grandson's life. Freedom had returned, not in triumph, but in exhaustion, in dirt, and in gratitude. The beaches of Normandy had been won, but victory in war is never clean and never free. Behind the smoke of D-Day's triumph lay a deeper, harsher truth. The invasion was only the beginning. The real struggle for Europe was still to come. In the days after June 6, 1944, the Allied foothold in France stretched only a few miles inland. 5 fragile beachheads, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword were separated by hedgerows, narrow roads, and enemy fire. The Germans were regrouping fast. From across occupied France, tanks, artillery, and infantry poured toward Normandy. The sky that had carried liberation now filled with smoke again. For the men on the ground there was no rest. They dug trenches, built supply lines, and pushed inland through mud and fire. Every mile forward was earned twice, once by blood, once by perseverance. The hedgerows of Normandy were unlike anything the Allies had ever faced. Each field was surrounded by thick, ancient earth banks and dense vegetation, perfect for ambushes. German snipers hid among the leaves, machine guns waited behind every corner, and mortars rained from unseen positions. Progress was measured in feet, not miles. Battles that should have lasted hours dragged on for days. Towns like Carentan, Saint-Lô, and Caen became names of horror and endurance. The skies thundered with constant air raids. The roar of Allied bombers shook the countryside, dropping tons of explosives on German strongholds. But with every victory came civilian tragedy. Entire villages were reduced to rubble. Families who had waited years for liberation now found themselves homeless or mourning the dead. Freedom had returned, but it came through fire. The Germans fought fiercely. They knew that if Normandy fell, the war would move into the heart of their homeland. The Panzer divisions, Germany's armored pride, counterattacked relentlessly. In the fields near Caen, entire villages disappeared under tank fire. The SS troops, fanatically loyal to Hitler, showed no mercy. For them, surrender was unthinkable. But the Allies held firm. American, British, and Canadian troops advanced side by side, learning from each battle, adapting, surviving. The lessons of D-Day had hardened them. They had seen death, faced chaos, and now moved with grim determination. By July, Caen finally fell after weeks of brutal urban combat. Its streets were unrecognizable, shattered stone, broken glass, and silence. But it marked a turning point. With Caen captured, the Allies controlled the key roads of Normandy. The next phase could begin, the breakout. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, shattered the German lines. Thousands of Allied bombers carpet-bombed the front, opening a massive breach in the enemy defenses. Through that gap poured the armored divisions of General Omar Bradley and General George S. Patton. The breakout was swift and unstoppable. German troops, already exhausted and low on fuel, began to collapse. By early August, the Allies had surrounded tens of thousands of German soldiers in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. The fighting there was savage. Trapped and desperate, the King Germans tried to escape through fields and forests. Allied artillery and airstrikes pounded them relentlessly. When it was over, the roads were lined with wrecked vehicles and burned tanks, the shattered remnants of the German 7th Army. Normandy was free. As the Allied armies pushed east, they were greeted by crowds of civilians. In every liberated town, people flooded the streets, waving flags, offering flowers, weeping openly. After 4 years of occupation, they could finally speak, sing, and dream again. French resistance fighters emerged from the shadows, guiding Allied patrols, capturing collaborators, and restoring order where they could. But amid the celebration, the soldiers moved on. They had seen too much to rejoice. They knew the war was not over. Ahead lay Paris, Belgium, and the long road to Germany itself. Many of them would never see home again. The cost of victory in Normandy was staggering. By the end of August 1944, the Allies had suffered more than 200,000 casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. The Germans lost even more, along with almost all their equipment in the region. The French civilian toll was devastating. Tens of thousands killed in the crossfire, cities flattened by bombs meant for the enemy. The price of freedom was written in ashes. For Eisenhower, the emotion was bittersweet. He had accomplished the impossible, launched and sustained the largest amphibious invasion in history. But each report of the dead weighed on him personally. He had walked the beaches after the battle, seen the wreckage, and spoken to the wounded. He carried their faces in his mind for the rest of his life. He later wrote, "No triumph is pure. The cost of freedom is measured not in victory, but in the lives of those who bought it." In the weeks that followed, Paris was liberated. Crowds filled the streets as Allied tanks rolled in, the Eiffel Tower standing tall above the smoke. The bells of Notre Dame rang for the first time in years. It was the sound of hope, reborn. But for the soldiers who had come from Normandy, the celebration was brief. They had done their part. Now the war had to be finished. The march toward Germany continued. By the end of 1944, Hitler's forces were retreating on all fronts. The invasion of Normandy had opened the door to Europe's salvation. From that narrow strip of sand, the tide of the entire war had turned. And yet, for many of the men who fought there, peace never truly came. They carried the memories of that day, of friends lost, of fear overcome, of courage found, for the rest of their lives. In the years that followed, they spoke little. Some could never speak at all. They had seen too much, and no words could capture it. Today, the beaches of Normandy are quiet. The wind moves gently through the grass. The sea rolls in softly against the sand. But beneath that calm lie the ghosts of June 6th, the soldiers who never left, the voices of a generation that gave everything so others could live free. Row upon row of white crosses stand over them, each marking a story cut short. The names stretch to the horizon: Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Gold, Sword. 5 beaches, 5 chapters of sacrifice. Every visitor who walks those shores walks in the footsteps of giants. The freedom we know today began there, not in triumph, but in terror, not in glory, but in endurance. They didn't just invade a continent, they reclaimed humanity itself. Operation Overlord was more than a military success. It was a testament to what unity, courage, and faith can achieve when the world stands together against tyranny. It was the day when nations became one, when strangers became brothers, and when history itself bent toward freedom. The tide had turned, and it never turned back. This was the inside story of D-Day. This was Operation Overlord, and this is the unknown zone.